As you can see, I've been busy. By way of explanation, let me ask you a question. And that would be, what are the tools that are essential for you in the kitchen? It's not an easy question. As a professional chef, for example, unless I'm really careful, I very quickly get overwhelmed with too many esoteric tools, pots, and pans. Now, what I'd like to do is see if I can find a way to help you select the tools that you need so that your kitchen becomes a friendlier, safer, more enjoyable place. For me, a trip to the kitchen store is like an all-expense-paid trip for a kid to the candy shop. I've got to be so careful, otherwise I come back and I've got so much in my kitchen that I can barely move. What I've learned over the years, I'm going to share with you right now. This is a news flash. You don't need a lot of tools. You just need the right tools. Now, before we look at these pots and pans, let me give you some guidelines. If you have a new piece of equipment and you bring it into your kitchen, notice how often you use it. If you have a piece of equipment like a cutting board or a knife that not only gets used on a daily basis, but many times on a daily basis, I would say that is an essential piece of equipment, and you should feel fine about spending a lot of money and getting exactly what you want. But if you have a piece of equipment that you use once a week, maybe every 2 weeks, that might be helpful, but I wouldn't say it's essential. And if you have a piece of equipment that you only use every month or 2 months, that might just be an unnecessary piece of equipment for you to keep on hand in your kitchen. Now, there's exceptions to every rule. If I were a kid and I had to grow up without a waffle iron in the house, I would probably go on strike. But the waffle iron doesn't need to live in the kitchen if it only gets used twice a year. It can live in the basement or the garage. That way, those tools that are esoteric and not used very often won't clutter up your life on a daily basis. Now, understand that what I just said are guidelines only. They're not hard and fast rules. You can do exactly what you want. My goal is to move you towards a kitchen that works for you and for the food that you would like to cook in that kitchen. Let's get started. Let's take a look at some of these pots, shall we? What I'd like to do is start with these saucepans. I think it's a good idea to have a selection of saucepans. They all should have tight-fitting lids, and as they get bigger, it's not a bad idea if they have a second handle the way this one does, because they can get pretty unwieldy if they're full of food. So, saucepans 1. Let me set those aside, and I'm going to bring up these 2 pans. Both of them are non-stick pans, and these are invaluable if you're cooking eggs. And if you're like me, you'll be cooking eggs 2-3 times a week. Take really good care of them and don't use them for anything else, and the non-stick coating will keep very, very well. Here's a couple more pans I'd like to take a look at. Here I've got a sauteuse, and you can see that it has a sloping sides. You may know this as a sauté pan or a frying pan. The sloping sides are important because they allow you to flip food and move it very, very quickly over high heat. On this side, I have a similar pan. You might call it a frying pan, but notice that the sides are straight and it's a little bit deeper, and then it has a tight-fitting lid. This is called a sautoir, and it's great if you want to fry a piece of chicken and then make a sauce, like chicken marengo. You can make the sauce right in there, you can put a lid on and trap the steam. So, sautoir, sauteuse, both frying pans. I have a selection of pots, so if these are pans, then these are pots. What you're looking at here is stock pots and pots that you might use for boiling pasta or cooking a lot of soup. Traditional for a stock pot in a professional kitchen is a narrower pot that's deeper. That way it takes up less room on the stovetop and you don't get so much evaporation over a long period of cooking. When you're making soup, you might want a shallower pot like this that makes it easier to manipulate the food inside, and you don't get so much steaming, which can prevent things from browning. This pot right here is a stock pot. You can see it has the tall, narrow conformation. I might cook pasta in this, but what I want to show you is that I have a couple of inserts. The first is a perforated insert that sits on the top of the pot, and with water down below and a lid up above, this becomes a serviceable steamer. So there's a steamer. I have another insert that's a little bit deeper. It's also perforated. And when I put it in, if there were boiling water in this pot, I could put my pasta in there, and then when it's time to take the pasta out of the water, I lift the insert, I allow the water to drain, and I can take this and put it right in with my sauce. So those are handy things. If you do a lot of steaming or if you cook a lot of pasta, I would say you might want to have something like that on hand. If I'm not mistaken, many of you probably use something like this, a colander, and when your pasta is ready, you put the colander in the sink and you just dump the pasta right in there. It works. I did it myself the same way for many, many years. If there's a downside to it, you lose the pasta water, and that's a precious commodity. You can use it to adjust consistencies and make really simple sauces. But a colander is not a bad thing to have on hand. And then finally, I'd like to take a look at stainless steel bowls. And I've got a selection, a big one that might hold salad for 8 or 10 people, and a small one like this that might be just right for making the salad dressing that goes on that salad. Now, if you'll notice, there are salad bowls that are rounded on the bottom, and this is great if you want to have a whip in here and touch all the foodstuffs. If, on the other hand, you're not whipping, you're just mixing something up, then a flat-bottomed pan like this is fine. If you don't need to get into the corners as readily, this might be ideal. And this particular bowl is like a hybrid of the two. It has a flat bottom, but the curved sides go almost all the way down to the center. Finally, I've got some roasting pans right in the front here. I've got a smaller one, and I would say this would be appropriate if I was making a lasagna or if I was roasting a chicken. Here, this might be appropriate if I was doing a turkey at Thanksgiving or even a prime rib. So large, small, they both have value, and I would say there's a good reason to have both of them. All right, enough of pots and pans. Let's take a look at hand tools next. Okay. We took a look at pots and pans. I've got 2 more pots and pans that I want to share with you. These are certainly non-essential, except if you're in my kitchen. So these are sort of the outliers for me. I've got a really wonderful cast iron pan that's beautifully seasoned. This is as non-stick as it comes, and I just use this again and again and again. I love it because it holds the heat so well. And then here is a braising pot that is oval, so when I put a pot roast in there, there's not a lot of extra room around the outside. When it goes into the oven, the cast iron is so heavy that the heat is diffused and it comes to the meat in a very even way. I don't use these all the time, but I would be lost without them. So these are in my kitchen all the time. What you see on these trays are the contents of the kitchen drawers, really. So let's take a look. Here's 2 different whips. This is a balloon whip, and it's great for whipping air into things. If you want to whip up cream or whip egg whites, that does a great job. This is what's known as a sauce whip, and you can see the wires are much heavier, and you can see that the head is much narrower. Because it has a narrower head, you can get this into the corners of a saucepan, and you might be stirring a little bit of flour and water into a sauce to make it thick. The sauce whip would be appropriate there. The balloon whip is more appropriate for whipping air into preparations. Now, these pots right here, I know as bain-marie inserts. So Marie's bath is a hot water bath, and if you wanted to keep a soup warm, you could put it in here and then put that into a larger pot of water. For our purposes, I'm going to put some of these tools in there. Let's talk tongs. Here are 2 sets of tongs, the baby and the daddy. A short one like this is appropriate when you're doing fine work, but sometimes if you're on the grill and the fire is hot, being that close, your hand starts to burn. So a longer set of tongs is a really handy thing to have. So short tongs and long tongs. Here are ladles. And ladles, as you know, are great for portioning out soup or taking clarified butter and putting it into a hollandaise as it's being made. What you may not know is that the size or the volume of the bowl is typically written on the handle. So this holds 2 ounces right here. That's a 2-ounce ladle. And this is a 4-ounce ladle. That can come in really handy when you have to measure what's being added. If a recipe, for instance, calls for half a cup of oil, you fill that up and off you go. It's nice to have ladles of different sizes. Here are 2 spatulas. This one is great for flipping eggs. This one with the longer base I think of as a fish spatula. So anything that is threatening to break because it's so tender, you may want to have a longer spatula underneath it. So a fish spatula, and you might call it a pancake turner. While we're on spatulas, here is a rubber spatula. And this particular one has a silicone end that is heat tolerant. I can get this up to 700 degrees and it won't melt. That's very different than a plastic spatula that you put into a saute pan when you're making an omelet, and now you have little chips of plastic in your omelet. So look for one that has a silicone heat tolerant end. It's a little more expensive, but well worth it. Here are a couple of spoons. Now, I have a wooden spoon, which I absolutely love to use. If you have aluminum pans, I would say this is indispensable, because a stainless steel spoon rubbing against an aluminum pan will turn a light-colored preparation gray. All right, so a wooden spoon is great for that. It just feels good in your hand as well. When you buy stainless steel spoons, I would make sure that you've got a solid spoon, which is appropriate if you're trying to gather up sauce and move it to a plate. And I would buy a slotted or a perforated spoon so that when you dip your Brussels sprouts out of butter, the butter can drain off before you move the food to the plate. So a solid spoon and a slotted or perforated spoon. These are both skimmers. This one right here is appropriate for skimming stocks and sauces. This one, with an open net, is more appropriate for dipping foods out of hot oil, and because it's open, the oil will drain away very, very quickly. So this is a skimmer. What I usually call this is a spider, more open. We talked about a pasta insert in a big pot of pasta cooking water. This is a pasta basket. So you have pre-cooked pasta, you put it in here just before your sauce is ready, and this goes into the sauce and hangs on the edge of the pot like that. And when it's time to take it out, you simply lift it up, drain it, and put it right into the water. 4 very simple tools. A brush. This is handy when you want to brush oil on the top of something. This is a food-grade brush, and it tolerates heat. So if it accidentally touches the pan, the bristles won't melt. An ice cream scoop. It's great for ice cream, but more than that, it's great when you're portioning muffins or portioning small amounts of anything. These are measured. Kitchen shears are great. You use the kitchen shears for any cutting that goes on in the kitchen. And then finally, I've got a meat mallet, and this is great if you're pounding or tenderizing meat. If you don't have that, sometimes I'll take just a small saucepan and use that to pound meat. These pans that I've been working off of, these are nothing more than cookie sheets. I call them half-sheet pans. But a nice selection of cookie sheets or sheet pans, I think, is handy to have on hand. There is a box grater, and it has multiple options on all 4 sides. So having a grater on hand is great. When we start to roast meat, it's really handy to be able to take the temperature of meat. And so I have a small digital thermometer and then a larger one with a probe that can be put into a roast beef. And we can monitor the progress of the roast beef as it cooks. Last but not least, there's a selection of dishes that you can serve from, but they're handy to have in the kitchen to store mise en place. So I've chopped up onions, I put them into a small ramekin or a bowl. I've chopped up a bunch of celery, it goes into a little oven-proof dish. Finally, I've got measuring cups. This is a pint. Here's a cup. It's graduated so that I can follow recipes with some confidence that the recipe will come out exactly the way it should because I'm being accurate. That's it on hand tools and small wares. Let's get into the kitchen and do some cooking. I'd like to make a really simple vegetable stew that you may know already, ratatouille. It'd be a shame if all we did today was talk about pots and pans, hand tools, and small wares. So I want to get into the kitchen and do a little bit of cooking as well. And I've got a recipe here that will illustrate a lot of interesting techniques. I'm going to make a ratatouille. And I have right here in front of me a couple of onions and a pan that's on the heat. We're going to start by getting some onions into this pan to saute. Now, I'm going to dice this onion up. You saw us do it the last show, but I'm going to do it again. All right. The pan is hot. In goes olive oil. Onions have a really harsh, sulfurous quality. And for that reason, most recipes will start with the onions in the pan so that they can cook a little bit and lose some of that sulfurous quality and pick up some sweetness. Okay, I'm going to let those saute a little bit. And I'm going to share a technique for making something called tomato concasse. If you've had ratatouille, you know it has tomato in there. But if you take tomatoes like this and just chop them up and put them in, you've got the seeds floating around, and you've got the skins, which will slip off in short order and float around like somebody's lost Band-Aid. So here's how you make tomato concasse, which is really peeled, seeded, diced tomatoes. You take your knife and you cut the core of the tomato out. That can get discarded. I'm going to do 3 or 4 here. On the opposite end, this is the blossom end, take your knife and just put a quick cross in the skin. That's all it takes. I've got boiling water here. I'm going to turn it all the way up, and we're going to put these tomatoes into boiling water. Now, if they're very ripe, usually within about 10 seconds or so, you will see that the skin begins to split. Or where you cut the cross, it will begin to spread and peel away. The riper the tomato is, the faster that will happen. But for a tomato like this, I'm thinking 10 seconds is about enough. Once the skin has loosened so that I can peel it off, I'm going to dip these out and put them directly into ice water to keep the tomato pulp from cooking. All right. If you want, you can test them just by peeling where you cut the cross. These are fine. Out they come, directly into ice water, and we'll let the cooking stop. Let me move this water away, and I'm going to add the next ingredient here. I want to put some eggplants into this ratatouille and allow this diced eggplant to saute just a little bit. Now, I am not a big advocate of undercooked eggplant. I think it needs to be cooked if it's going to taste good. One of the challenges with eggplant is that it's very, very thirsty, and so I'm going to add just a little more oil. and we'll allow that eggplant to cook right along with the onions. And let's see how we're doing here with the tomatoes. Here's the cut that I cut, the cross that I cut into the skin. I'm going to get in here and just peel that skin away. You can do the same thing with peaches. If you want to peel peaches, you put them into boiling water very, very briefly, and then you can slip the peel right off. Now, if I'm not cooking tomatoes, then usually I leave the peel on. I love the way it tastes. I know there's a lot of nutrition in the peel. This could go into a stock pot, but for our purposes in this dish, I don't want to have the peel on the outside of the tomato because I know it's going to slip off when it begins to cook. In effect, what I'm doing here ahead is exactly what would happen in this pan. The skin would slip off, and imagine that you had all of this floating around in your ratatouille. When you buy canned tomatoes, often this has been done already, and so out of season, I would say you might buy canned tomatoes and use canned tomatoes. Now, I'm going to cut the tomatoes in half between the stem end and the blossom end. And what that does is it opens up all of these little seed cavities, and I can give them a little squeeze and take the seeds out. And we'll see how things are coming along here on the stove. The eggplant has had just a little bit of time to cook. I'm going to take these tomatoes now, and I'm going to cut them. I'm going to dice them up, and that's about a ½ dice. Not too fine. I know that as they cook, they will begin to come apart a little bit. So for each half, I'm cutting it horizontally first in half, and then cutting it into ½ strips, turning it 90 degrees, and cutting it again. I'm going to put in a little bit of tomato paste. And start to saute that. As you can see, those eggplant slices were so thirsty that a lot of that oil has been absorbed. I'm going to add the tomato paste and just cook it until it goes from a bright red to something a little brickish. Make sure nothing burns on the bottom of the pan. And next, in goes my tomatoes. I'm going to stew this dish from this point on. I'm going to turn the heat down just a little bit. Take just a second to wipe my board clean, get my knife clean, and let's see what other ingredients have still to go into our ratatouille. A little bit of garlic, or maybe a lot of garlic. That sounds good to me. And I'm going to crush it just a little bit, just like that, so it's flat, and then chop it coarsely. As this ratatouille stews, the garlic will soften and melt away. I'm going to add some yellow peppers and some green peppers. I'm going to introduce some zucchini. This is really about the bounty of the summer garden, huh? Should be very, very colorful. I'm going to add a couple of branches of herbs, so there goes some thyme. And we'll set this tray behind. So right now we've got peppers, zucchini, we've got eggplant, we have tomatoes. And I'm going to introduce just a little bit of water. You could use stock as well, or vegetable stock, but we have the water that we used to make tomato concasse. Just enough water so that these vegetables can stew. I'm going to put a lid on top and turn the temperature way, way down and move over one that's been simmering and stewing probably for about 20 minutes. I want to cook it very, very gently. So let me turn that almost off. There we are. Very, very gently. Okay, we're going to let these stew for a little bit. I've got one all done. We might as well give it a taste and see if it needs any seasoning. Salt and pepper is all I'm going to add, and a little bit of fresh olive oil. I love the richness and the flavor of olive oil. We'll stir that together. You know, as you cook vegetables, oftentimes you believe that vegetables have to be cooked al dente, but in this case, you want everything to be very, very tender. Each of these vegetables gives up their own integrity for the greater good of this dish, and this stew is really more than the sum of the parts. It is a celebration of the summer garden. Now, as that's cooking away there, I've got something else that I would love to share with you. This is a basic kitchen preparation called clarified butter. And clarified butter is a butter that's been melted, and you allow it to melt so that it will separate. And in separating, what you will see is that it separates into its components. So one of the components is butterfat. One of the components is buttermilk, and one of the components is milk solids. And of those three, the butterfat tolerates heat very well, and the other two, not so much. If you've ever had this experience in the morning where you put a pan on to make scrambled eggs, and suddenly the butter has already burned, the problem is those components that burn easily. So I melt butter over a very low flame. It will melt, and it will begin looking like this. It will start to separate into its components. It's maybe a little bit easier to see in this pan because it's gone a little bit further. What's floating on the top of this is milk solids. On the bottom is buttermilk. Now, once it starts to separate, I can take a ladle and skim the milk solids off of this butter. Skim them away and continue to cook it over a very slow, gentle heat. And as it cooks, it will separate even a little bit more. And ultimately, I will get to a point where the butter will look like this, very nearly clear. The butter solids have been skimmed away. The buttermilk, I decanted the butter fat off the top. And at the final example, what you can see is a clear butter fat that has a very high tolerance for heat. I would say this will burn at about 250 degrees. And by the time you get over to these last examples, the tolerance for heat has gone all the way up to 300 plus. The flavor is still the flavor of butter. So if you want to taste it, you certainly can. It tastes of butter. It looks of butter, but you can see it's a pure fat, nice and clear, and ready for sautéing. Let me show you what you might use that for. I'm going to let this butter continue to simmer away here on the end of the stove. Maybe I can put this right next door, and you can see how close these two are. You know, this has lost almost all of its milk solids. They've been skimmed away. And here, perfectly clear, clarified butter. What you might use that for is cooking eggs. And you can be a little bit careful and use whole butter, but with clarified butter, you've got some extra insurance. So I'm going to put a little bit of this clarified butter into a pan. I'll turn this burner on, and we'll bring it up to temperature. Now, we've got some different components here. I made tomato concasse. It turned into a ratatouille that you see right here in front. I'm going to show you what a real simple evening supper might look like. I oftentimes will have a glass of wine in the evening, go to the refrigerator and see what it is that I have available. And imagine that I had some ratatouille on hand. I could warm it up and just put it into a little oven-proof dish like this. There's plenty of flavor here for me, but what I'm lacking is protein. So I pull out a little non-stick pan like this one, and I'm going to fry an egg very, very quickly. There's a little shell that doesn't belong. There we are. That egg can be seasoned with salt and pepper. We'll leave it sunny side up. And we'll let that cook very, very nicely. I'm going to bring this placemat over. I'm going to set the table. The pan is telling me to pay attention because there's a little bit of sizzling going on. If you see, this egg moves beautifully in the bottom of this nonstick pan. And there's no burning at all because the butter had the butter solids in there. It behaves really, really nicely. I'm going to turn it down just a little bit more. And we're going to leave this egg sunny side up. So I want it to cook sort of gently. You can see as this butter here is melting, it's throwing off all kinds of butter solids. While I'm waiting, I can come and scoop off a few more of these. The process of clarifying butter is one that you can start, and usually a couple of hours later it's done. Just let it simmer very, very gently on the edge of the stove, and I think 2 hours later it will have separated into clear fat, the white foam on the top, and the buttermilk below. So let me move this away. If we make a little indentation in the top of this, then as this egg is done, I can slide it right off on top of the ratatouille. I might have a little piece of baguette to go along with this. And I would take it right to the table, fork, knife, and a real simple little supper. Ratatouille with a fried egg, a nice glass of wine, a celebration of the summer garden.